Look, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's probably appropriate that we start our webinar. On behalf of the West Australian chapter of the Australia-India Business Council, it really does give me immense pleasure to have you join us here today from Perth, from Chennai, and even from Pune. I saw a Indian client dial in from Pune who's been down to Perth recently to consummate some business, so it's great that they've joined in, and many others today, to be a part of our webinar, Navigating the Way Forward for West Australia and India. And of course, this has all been brought about by the collaboration that the Australia-India Business Council and support has had with our webinar partners, the University of Western Australia, the Perth USAsia Centre, and it was only earlier this week that I was fortunate to attend a terrific program that was put on by the Perth USAsia Centre with insights and perspectives from the Australian Consul General in Mumbai. Always, it's great to have the support from the Indian Consulate here in Perth. Madam, we always appreciate the support that we get from you. And certainly, of course, from the West Australian Trade Office in Mumbai, it's wonderful that Mr. Peter Baldwin, who is the West Australian Government Trade Commissioner, can join us here today. Of course, support from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Western Australia. And of course, last but not least, it's wonderful to have Ms. Sudha here from Invest India. And again, she's dialed in from Chennai this afternoon. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that the timing of this webinar is particularly relevant. Of recent this month, we've had the Indian government that announced a recent May stimulus package. It's worth around about $260 billion. An agenda that's going to be focused on reform aspects, looking into India's agricultural sector, looking at the privatisation of both state and owned enterprises. And I think at the end of the day, this in itself will provide terrific opportunities for West Australian companies looking to pursue trade and in investment agendas. Prime Minister Modi, of course, has this vision of a self-reliant India, but by no means does that mean that India has a less appetite, if you like, for international engagement. If anything, I think it provides even greater opportunities for West Australian companies that are pursuing both global supply and global value chain opportunities with the country. And only next week, we'll have both the Prime Minister of Australia and the Prime Minister of India in what could be called a virtual summit, and that's happening on the 4th of June. And they will be, as we're expecting, to sign several very important both economic and defence agreements. So with all of that going on, I think our timing was certainly right in if you like, having this very interactive and panel webinar today. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me a great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Anu Ram Mohan, who's the Associate Dean International at the University of Western Australia, to share some opening remarks and insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I just wanted to say that UWA, as you know, is a research-intensive university and is a member of the prestigious group of 8 universities in Australia. So India is a key part of UWA's strategy, and this is articulated in UWA's Vision 2030. And as part of that strategy, UWA has created the Public Policy Institute and also set up the Australia-India Institute. And also, as you're aware, there's the Perth USAsia Centre, which is also located at UWA. And what we seek to do as part of our engagement with India is to build capacity for greater engaged research in India and to build our India-focused academics and also to engage with the Indian diaspora, both in Perth as well as Australia, and also build our alumni network. So with that, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Anu. I'd now like to move across to our moderator for today's session, and that, of course, is Ms. Nima Premji. I'm having a good day, aren't I? Nima sits on the board of the West Australian AIBC committee. She also sits on the board as a director of the Australia-India Council. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand across to Nima.
Thank you, Michael. So just for our listeners, the way that this panel discussion will occur is I'll be putting a question to the panelist, and each panelist will be given a time frame of about 2.5 minutes to answer. And while they're answering, just for yourselves, if you've got questions that come up, there's a Q&A. Please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat box, so that in Q&A we have access to it. And then what will happen is after 20 minutes, we will then go to the questions, and I will then put the question to the relevant panelist. So that's taken care of the housekeeping. So first of all, thank you to all the panelists for being with us. Just very quickly, we have Ms. Dantu Charandasi for the Indian Consul General in Perth, Dr. Gordon Flake, Perth USAsia Centre, Mr. Peter Baldwin, WA Trade Commissioner to Mumbai, Ms. Sudha Chandrasekaran, Assistant Vice President of Invest India, and of course, Mr. Michael Carter, who is the President of Australia-India Business Council in WA, and also Head of International Trade for the Chamber of Commerce. So in starting off, I'd like to put the first question, and I'll give a bit of a context to it. The context being that everybody's starting to talk about post-COVID-19, but no one actually knows when we're going to be in post-COVID-19. Some people say it's a vaccine, no, until then. However, each country is now looking at the road to recovery. And what we have questions for the panelists is that we would like to hear your insights and perspectives on the opportunities for the bilateral business and trade opportunities between Western Australia and India. And in particular, would like to ask you, how can we in WA immediately, right now, as in we start to act right now, to pre-position ourselves in identifying and developing business opportunities so that we start to put the runs on the ground and onto the board. And in particular, when you're answering that question, give us some very practical ways of where we can position ourselves. And also, if you know of any emerging markets or industry sectors that we can immediately start to get into. So the first question I will ask Ms. Dantu Charandasi, hopefully she's been able to hear you, Michael, through the phone, to give us her insights and perspectives.
Good evening. Thank you, Nima. Mr. Michael Carter, thanks to IIBC WA chapter for organizing this webinar. Good to connect to Mr. Peter Baldwin, Mr. Gordon Flake, Ms. Sudha, and Professor Anurag Mohan. The coronavirus pandemic has created a global crisis, forcing the world to deal with catastrophic health emergency and massive economic crisis. The Government of India has taken a number of initiatives to deal with these issues. We are committed to build a self-reliant India and at the same time expanding to play a greater role in becoming part of global supply chains. A number of measures have been announced by Finance Minister of India on motivating business and investment-focused growth, enabling investment and trade reforms, and opening up India as an investment destination in a number of areas, namely agriculture, MSME, coal minerals, defense, space, atomic energy, power distribution, civil aviation, social infrastructure development, health and technology-driven education. As for opportunities to increase India-Western Australia partnership, I think with India easing regulations for doing business and with the perspective of playing a greater role in global supply chains and the initiatives of Western Australia on diversifying trade, the main focus areas we can look at are critical minerals, agriculture and food processing, including fisheries, fruits, vegetables and spices, mining and mets, advanced manufacturing. Make in India can play a significant role here. IT and digital technology startups, IT companies are looking for expansion and increasing their presence here to support war-based resource companies, as also in public sector in areas like port development, etc. There are opportunities to leverage AI technology for joint startups. Other areas which I think include healthcare, education and trained workforce, and tourism, hospitality, and entertainment sectors. I think these are some of the areas which can be prioritized of being basics and to start sector-wise. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Charandasi. And I think from there, I would like to go to Gordon Flake and get your insights and perspectives on how we can further our trade opportunities.
Well, thank you, Nima, and thank you to both all the other panelists and AIBC for organizing this. It's fantastic. I very much appreciate the way Nima honed the question down to what can we do today, rather than just talking philosophically about what we might do one day in the future, because it is clear that the COVID-19 global pandemic, if nothing else, will slow down the process. The good news is the underlying dynamics in India, the demographics, the economic growth, the aspirations of its people, the policies that have led to such optimism over the last 5 years, they have not gone away. They're still there. And so India remains, the essential target for diversification for countries like Australia, but really any other country around the globe. That part hasn't changed at all. The question really is one of timing. And unfortunately, we really can't afford just to wait until there's a vaccine, until the COVID-19 pandemic is over. I thought I might start off by recognizing that any conversation we have on this is built on the foundation of a lot of previous work that has been done. I think the work of the Australian India Business Council has been exemplary. We've all benefited tremendously by the India economic strategy that was put together by former High Commissioner to India and former Foreign Secretary Peter Varghese. We are very fortunate that India is, even as we speak, currently working on and now updating and revising a Australia economic strategy for India. I would note that my colleague Hugo Seymour did a wonderful interview with Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, the lead author of that report. For those of you that are interested, that's something that I think is worth watching just because of the detailed conversation that came out on that. And again, I would note that my colleague Hugo Seymour earlier this year in February put out a very specific paper for WA. I had a chance to review it this morning. And if you look at that paper, there's nothing that has changed because of COVID-19 other than new obstacles. The underlying dynamics, the underlying opportunities, the underlying relationships remain exactly the same. It's just going to be a little bit harder and take a little bit longer than we had planned to before. But I thought today, since I'm probably already getting close to my time that we've been allotted, but I might focus on, I think, the most important element here, and that is people. Interestingly enough, in some of Australia's other trade relationships, despite the fact that we talk about people, they are arguably not the most important thing, right? Some of them are commodities, some of them are energy, some of them are iron ore, some of them are coal. But if you look at the Australia-India economic relationship, in particular, you look at the future, it really is all about people. And one of the things that struck me in the last several trips I've taken to India is the growing recognition in India of the growing Indian-Australian community. We forget that there are already over 700,000 Indian Australians, so Australians of Indian origin. And the vast majority of those are relatively recent migrants. Estimates are within the next 5 years, again, the question is what happens with COVID-19, there will be over 1 million Australians of Indian origin out of a population of just over 25 million. And if nothing else gives you optimism for the relationship, that should give you optimism. Because ultimately, it is the creativity, the connections, the ties, the desires of that community that's going to work. So if I can tie that back to the very specific question that Nima raised, what can we do now? Well, what we can do now is on a state government level, on a university level, on a firm level, on an organization level, engage ever more deeply with the Indian Australian community. Because they're the ones, particularly the recent arrivals, who have the context and the friends, you know, and the organizations back there. It's not like we have to kind of make this up out of whole cloth and just invent it anew today. Those are already pre-existing. The other thing I would add on this front, there was a wonderful op-ed that came out in the Canberra Times today, written by Peter Jennings, who's the head of ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And like most things, it tended to focus heavily on China because it was talking about the relative exposure of Australian universities to Chinese students. There's some 212,000 students, you know, that are coming out of China. And the proposal they levered, and again, this is a policy debate, was that Australia should allocate 100,000 positions at Australian universities for students from South Asia, like India and Southeast Asia, and pay for them at local Australian government rates, full ride scholarships, 100,000. I can't think of anything that would be more transformational to our relationship than to get more Indian students, more Indian tourists, because what follows students and tourists, you know, are business people and relationships. And again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, it's relationships that matter. So me, in the long run, you know, the greatest hope we have for the India-Australia economic relationship is the engine of that relationship will be our valued and growing Indian-Australian community. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I really do appreciate that. Now, Peter, you'll be the person. So, Peter, the other, just looking at the Q&A, it may be an opportunity for you to even indicate whether there will be a shift in any policy settings during this by our West Australian government. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Nima, and greetings to everyone out there. Look, the situation within state government is that we are providing weekly and fortnightly updates on perhaps opportunities and how we may look for benefits or mitigation. And certainly the focus is on India quite a lot as a source of diversifying our markets away from China. What might come out of some of those policy considerations? I'm hopeful that there will be some positive ones, and I think that they'll be coming through from federal government as well as possibly state. But I think things like providing for students recognition of online learning for post-study work rights and that will help us, I think, in Western Australia, given the proximity of our time differences. Certainly, I've heard anecdotally that the Eastern States University is trying to present online courses. The 4.5 hours time difference is making it more difficult than our 2.5 hours. So I think we can take advantage of that. I just also want to, what the Gordon's suggesting and Dantu before him. I think there will be a lot of opportunity, and I think the thing that we can think about doing now is recognising that my staff, although in lockdown in Mumbai, are still regularly communicating with business leaders and the confederations and the like, who many of them are looking at solutions to some of the issues that is caused in supply chain disruption. Again, agri-tech, we've had fielded a couple of calls, and diversifying agri-markets also. So I think, they can be approached now through me or directly. Some of them are sitting in watching this now. Hopefully all of them are actually. And I think, we've got a really good crew there, really experienced, really good networks that they can do now. So if anyone out there wants to think about the India opportunity in particular sectors that they might be interested in, that can happen now. And it's also a fact that this might even be easier, whereas, relationship building with Indian businesses often took a lot of time, a lot of visits and a lot of money. No one's expecting visitors to India right now, but they are accepting telephone and video conference calls like this. And so it can be a way to get introduced into the market, and we can certainly provide those leads. So I might just leave it at that, and yeah, let's roll on. Cheers, thanks.
Thank you.
It's Mike Carter here. If I could probably just chip in quickly on that question, if I may. I think that what's encouraging is that, already the West Australian government, through its department, the Department of Primary Industries and Region Development, recently launched a $250,000 program to help West Australian businesses, particularly in the food and agribusiness space. So there were some 28 companies, small to medium, that have been beneficiaries of this terrific support, I think, from the WA government. And having seen those companies or seen the listing, I think there would be a number of companies there that would be particularly relevant for pursuing both trade and certainly investment opportunities with India. So I think, that's been a great starting point. And again, I think it really underpins what was launched last August, of course, which was the West Australian Government's Asian Engagement Strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. My next is to Sudha. Thank you so much for coming all the way from India. It's been a virtual space. One of the things that would be also good, Sudha, if you could, from your perspective, looking at right now, but also give us an indication if the government of India will be looking at shifting some of the policy settings so it could attract more investment opportunities both ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. So before that, I want to take a minute to, or less than that, to tell you what Invest India does. Invest India is the National Investment Promotion and Facilitation Agency set up by the Ministry of Commerce, Government of India. So whose mandate is to help investments as well as make it easy for investors and handhold the entire journey into India. So one thing I would like to mention when I'm starting off my little 2 cents is that, like about 2 days before the lockdown started in India, Invest India set up a business immunity platform under the guidance of Government of India, whose main goal is to ensure the industries are impacted as less as possible despite the complete nationwide lockdown. So till date, about approximately 60 days of lockdown, we've had about 3 million visitors to the particular platform in 60 days. Invest India has resolved about close to 7,000 queries with an average issue resolution time of about 4 to 6 hours. So the reason I am saying this is when the lockdown started, all of Invest India on an average was working 15 to 18 hours a day just to ensure the industry is not impacted as much. That was government's #1 priority with respect to industry facilitation. So this is a thought that has been in our government's mind from day one to make it easy for the investors. So that's one thing I wanted to bring to your notice. And the second thing is there have been significant landmark reforms at the central federal level, as well as the sectoral ministry levels, and right down to the state level also. A very remarkable example is yesterday, one of the states, Tamil Nadu, signed an MOU worth $2 billion yesterday, 60 days after the lockdown. $2 billion MOU across 15 to 18 countries for projects and everything to keep going. They have signed. So and Invest India is also facilitating and giving insights and inputs to our government on how to resuscitate the industry, the economic revival for India as well. So we have been working quite seamlessly with the government. We're acting as a central point as the voice of the industry to the government and representing to the government to the industry as well, along with able guidance from our CG here, looking at the Australian market. She has been extremely supportive of all the work that we've been doing here as well. Another thing I want to I do wish to add to the first question that you had asked, what are all the areas that you think have scope for us to work together on, and we can start working together on now? That was your question. So the advantages to me that Australia brings is it has a lead in technology that it brings to the table. It has tremendous potential in the R&D sector that it can bring to the table, and lots of natural resources, unparalleled natural resource availability is there, and it is a very welcoming country. Like the previous speaker, Mr. Gordon Flake, said, as of now, there are 700,000 Indians in Australia, and if I heard it right, he expects it to be 1 million in a few years' time. So it is indeed a very welcoming country as well. So people is a very important aspect. And what India brings to the table is abundant of talent that are willing to work, skilled labor force. So, amongst the ASEAN and the Asian players, India offers the highest amount of skilled workforce. Second to India is the difference between the first and the second country in ASEAN is, India is ahead in the curve by 5 times by the sheer number of people India has, like skilled workforce. India has 624 million that are ready to get into the market right now today. The second closest nation has about 125 million available with it in the pocket. So like I said, the people and the workforce is a huge area that we could, work on. And also the fact that India presents a huge domestic market for countries like Australia to come and set up, manufacturing shops in India. To not just, government is doing a lot of landmark reforms to help position India as an export base for you to export to the Middle East, the Africa, the US, the Americas, and Europe. Not only that, it also has the advantage of having a huge domestic market as well. And one of the other things that the government is very forthcoming now and doing is trying to help companies, match companies, find potential JV partners with whom they can work in India. So I do understand India is a conglomeration of smaller countries put together. The language changes, the cuisine changes, the attire changes every 500 kilometers within India. So we do, try our best to handhold the investors to make it very easy for them to navigate in India. We do help with finding potential JV partners as well. And the 3 main sectors, and then I will stop, 3 main sectors that I feel, there is a lot of potential, like Her Excellency Dantu Charandasi said, is, I see a lot of potential in the mining, especially the lithium ion mining. So it is, Australia is one of the largest producers of the lithium ion in the world. And from what I understand, Western Australia is one of the largest, mines that have this huge repository with the largest number of refineries as well in all of Australia for this lithium ion mining as well. The second opportunity would be in agriculture and food processing. Australia is ahead. A lot of technologies. It's one of the largest producers of dairy, and India, the demand is growing. So I see a lot of potential for dairy companies to come, and the food, not just dairy, in the food processing, farming, cold chains, grain handling technology, all sorts of technology for them to come and invest in the technology here and set up shop here. So agriculture and food processing would be one, mining would be one. The other thing would be, there is a lot of potential for startups as well that I see Australia and India can collaborate with the help of a lot of universities there. Have I overshot my time too much?
No, you're fine. Actually, interesting you mentioned startups. Everything you said there, I was just looking at the Q&A, and I think you just about answered all the questions. So there you go. You've done well. Well, very well done. Thank you. Now, Michael, I'm being cognizant of the time, and I thought I'll, as you know, give it to yourself, and then with the questions we've had, quite a few are just been many comments, which is great. Again, a big boulder there, Gordon. for a big boost by everybody here about the news that you gave us about the students. It's very much appreciated by the audience, and the fact that you mentioned startups. So on that note, and keeping in mind the time, Michael, I'll hand it over to you for you to answer the question and then take it into the wrap up.
Well, look, thanks, Nima. And I guess I'd like to sort of start off by, stating the obvious. I mean, the Indian Ocean, it doesn't separate Western Australia and India. In fact, it binds us in many ways more than we can imagine, both culturally and commercially. And I think with, West Australia's rich endowment in both our mining and METS capability, our international education and the vet sector, and certainly in our agribusiness and agtech, I think Western Australia is in a pivotal position to look at those trade and investment, both outward and inward opportunities, in working collaboratively with India to address those main themes that I often like to talk about, being around food security, energy security, and knowledge security. And if there's a marriage made in heaven, I suppose the resources that we have below the ground and we grow above the ground, I think have a tremendous synergy with India, one of India's greatest resources, and that of course is its talent, its innovation, and its skill set in its workforce and population that has a great capacity to help build that agenda across the Indian Ocean. It's interesting, certainly over the last 3 to 6 months, we have been fielding more inquiries, if you like, from India, companies looking to supply, for example, mining equipment, cable equipment for telco applications and the like. And I think in Western Australia, we need to be more cognizant of these opportunities for growing that bilateral trade and recognise that on our doorstep we have effectively the workshop of the world, which is India. So I think we all have a role to play, both in the organisations that we represent across state government, across industry bodies, iconic think tanks like Perth USAsia Centre, our educational universities, to really help and broaden that discussion. But to perhaps hark back to the comment that Professor Flake made earlier, it's really underpinned by the strength of those people-to-people relationships. And in Western Australia, where we have a Indian diaspora that is just over 1 lakh, I think, or thereabouts, I think there's a great opportunity to really build on that and really look at ways in which we can build those bridges across the Indian Ocean between Western Australia and India. So on that note, if I may, I'd now like to, in closing, firstly and foremost, personally thank all the panellists, the Indian Consul General, Ms. Dantu Charandasi, Ms. Sai Saduf, Assistant Vice President from Invest India, Mr. Peter Baldwin, the West Australian Trade Commissioner to Mumbai. And Peter, it's great that you are back in town. We certainly will be looking forward to catching up with you again shortly. And of course, last but not least, Professor Gordon Flake, CEO of Perth USAsia Centre, and also, of course, to Professor Anu Ram Mohan. Thank you for your opening remarks. And Nima, thank you in your role in moderating today's session. With all of these things, there are always people behind the scenes that help pull it together. I would like to also thank the National Secretariat of the Australia-India Business Council, Wendy Farrell, for pulling together the webinar, pulling together the slide pack that you can see now on your screen, and also to Wendy's capable assistant, Vishal. Thank you for that. And Prashant, thank you for reminding me that Hindi word for just doing it on the hop, if you like, jagged. I should have known that because it's probably very similar to that Aussie slang word, I jagged it, you know. And finally, in closing, I would like to acknowledge that we have the Honourable Yaz Murabakai Amalay, member for Jandakot, here in on this session. If there's ever a gentleman who's got huge amounts of passion about ways in which we can develop and really grow that relationship between India and West Australia, it's definitely Yaz. So really great to have you here this afternoon. Thank you indeed, Baya. And look, to everyone who's joined us today, we appreciate you taking the time to provide us an opportunity to share our thoughts and insights. And we look forward to keeping in touch and have a great weekend coming up, wherever you may be dialing in from. Thank you.
Thank you.